You're listening to episode 48 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Today we're joined by Dzogchen Ponlop Rinpoche, who speaks with us about breaking free of cultural accretions in his book Rebel Buddha, On the Road to Freedom. Being a rebel Buddha, no less. These are not words we expect to see together. We think of the word rebel, and images of tattoos and motorcycles may come to mind. We think of Buddha, and the sense brought to bear is serenity and calm insight. But there are many ways to be a rebel, and many ways to be a Buddha. Perhaps one of the most difficult ways to express our cognitive dissonance with tradition, any kind of tradition, is to question, to rebel by simply not accepting what has gone before. We see that a lot in our modern Western culture. We view rebellion as admirable, even heroic, especially when we question with confidence and base our questioning on experiences to which we can point and say, "See, this is what I mean." However, not all cultural backgrounds have the exercise of contrary views woven into their very fabric. When we do see dedication cropping up in places it hasn't had as much play, especially when it's from a sincere and compassionate heart for the benefit of others, it's something to celebrate. Dzogchen Ponlop Rinpoche is a leading Buddhist teacher in North America and an advocate of American and Western Buddhism. A lover of music, art, and urban culture, Rinpoche is a poet, an avid photographer, an accomplished calligrapher and visual artist. He is the founder and president of Nalanda Bodhi, an international network of Buddhist study and meditation centers, and of Nitartha International, a non-profit educational corporation dedicated to preserving the contemplative literature of East Asia. Rinpoche is the author of several books, most recently Rebel Buddha, On the Road to Freedom. He is a frequent contributor to Buddha Dharma, a practitioner's quarterly, and the Shambhala Sun. Rinpoche is active on Twitter and in the blogosphere, where you can find his posts on blogs such as Huffington Post, Intent.com, Elephant Journal, Shambhala Sunspace, and others. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice iced chai with mint. Everyone, my guest today is Dzogchen Ponlop Rinpoche. Rinpoche, thank you so much for being here.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here with you.
Very glad to have you here. As I was saying before we started the interview, that you were born in 1965 and I was born in 64, so we're of a very wonderful age for two men to be chatting today about one of our favorite topics, Buddhism.
That's right, Generation Xers.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and you mentioned that in the book, which for folks who are listening, this Sound of Tapping is the book that I have here. What we're chatting about today is the book Rebel Buddha, On the Road to Freedom. And I think before we go into the book, what I'd like to do is ask you, Rinpoche, to tell us a little bit about your journey and where you're from and how you came to be in the West.
Yes, as you have mentioned, I was born in 1965 in the northwest part of India. And my family was traditional Tibetan Buddhists. And so I grew up as a Buddhist as a youth, and I've been through the monastic training and a lot of traditional training with so much culture and ritual, and also lots of learning on philosophy and Buddhist psychology. And so it's been pretty standard, traditional Buddhist education that I went through. And the place I grew up was a very small village in northwestern state of Sikkim in India. It was a really beautiful, quiet and peaceful place. But as a young person growing up there, it was a little bit boring. but, but it was fine. We found plenty of our own thoughts to entertain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so when I was 14, my primary teacher, the 16th Karmapa, brought me to the United States, Canada, and part of Europe on his tour. And so that was my first introduction to the West.
Wow. So what was that like as being a 14-year-old, and people who are listening to this, who've downloaded the podcast, think about yourself at 14 and going on basically a world tour with your teacher, and this is someone I imagine you're very close with, and you've learned a great deal from him, and suddenly you're on this grand adventure from a small town. What was that like?
It was fascinating, actually, and I was thinking, like, wow, America will be quite different. But when we arrived at JFK and drove through, the city, to the Manhattan city, actually New York was pretty dirty.
Well, at least I didn't have to say it. Okay.
Part of the town the city we drove through was a little bit like India. And so I was thinking, like, oh, it's not really much different, There are paper cups flying around and, So it was quite interesting because, kind of like, good experience because I felt at home in some ways. And then, as I come to Manhattan, of course, skyscrapers and stuff like that, and everything's different. And then I begin to see the differences between India, especially my village, and in New York. And then, then I saw this newspaper called Village Voice. And I thought, like, wow, is that from Sikkim?
Yeah, nothing like that in Sikkim, I imagine.
So I really had a wonderful trip, actually, and learned a lot from my teacher and meeting the Western students. And so, observing the whole thing was great teaching for me.
Now, did you get to speak to many people when you were on the trip, or was it a lot of classes and not much interaction with the New Yorkers?
Oh, no, I got to talk to a lot of people since I was his attendant. So I was just hanging out with people and picking up some English. My English wasn't good enough back then to really have a substantial conversation. But I did have some chance to interact. And then later on, after that, we went back to Sikkim, and then I went through my education. And in early 90s, then I came back to New York to go to school at Columbia University.
So what kinds of, you're at Columbia University, you're taking classes, and are they humanities classes, or you're spreading out to a few other subjects while you're here?
I was taking American language program primarily, and then also I took some classes on comparative religion there.
So from that, when did you start teaching? At what point did that progress?
Actually, my teacher forced me to teach when I was when I was in the States at 14.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, that was pretty challenging and pretty zen. I was sitting up there, it's just like a koan, working with the koan, and similar to that. It's pretty nice. And But actually, I really started teaching here in America since early 90s, like 92, 93.
Your background then, it's a Tibetan Buddhist practice, and that is very culturally specific. And I know that some Westerners have had a difficult time adapting to it. Do you see Tibetan practice changing over time as it encounters Western culture?
Yes, actually, that's an interesting question because if you look back in the traditional, tantric teachings of Vajrayana Buddhism, which is Tibetan Buddhism, if you look back, actually, it has so much genuine practice and lots of philosophical or psychological teachings that are really beyond culture and form. And it's somehow either misunderstood or misrepresented in Asia and also in the West, that it became very cultural and ritual based,
Yeah, that it's very true in what you're saying. We see this in writings from many of the Tibetan teachers, and for those listening to the podcast, I imagine there are a number who are used to Pema Chodron or folks like that who are Westerners who've encountered Tibetan practice and are Vajrayana teachers, who are, their approach to teaching is very much on the practice and the study of the mind, and there doesn't seem to be quite the ritual accoutrements and the cultural trappings that you're talking about.
Absolutely. Actually, if you really look at the heart of Tibetan Buddhist teachings, there's so much formless meditation, directly working with our mind and the Buddha nature. And also there's a lot of teachings on metta, like loving
kindness. Yep.
And a lot of practices on that either also, as well as we have a lot of teachings on like also satipatthana, like mindfulness practices. And so all of these things get somehow lost in the richness of the ritual. And rituals have their own purpose, it's one of the skillful means, and that's why actually the Vajrayana is traditionally known as the practice of symbolism. And so all of these things like, the pictures of the deity, the Buddhas and so on, they all are symbolic, and there's deeper meaning behind that. And so when people are not familiar with the whole teaching, and when you just see one segment of that, then it looks very much like cultural.
Yeah, it gets misinterpreted as that's the depth of the teaching is, that's they're looking at a tanka and they say, that's like a patron saint, and they're worshiping that, rather than this is a metaphorical expression of a mind state and a step in the path, and that there's a confusion sometimes about a very rich cultural tradition and the stories that are in that, which are contributing to people's practice because they're reminders of things to watch out for. That I think what you're saying is that when we don't go into the depth of, okay, that's beautiful, now what's the metaphor? What does this mean? That's for the teachers like you engage and help us distinguish that.
Exactly. I have a funny story I heard recently, that there's a Buddhist stupa in America, and they have some deity figures, sculptures. And there are some American tourists coming to see the stupa, and they were walking up the stairs and they saw this image, and then they said like, oh my God, there's a devil here standing on a dead baby. And they all turned around and went back.
So there's an in-depth understanding of Buddhist practice right there.
Yes, exactly. Like some of these enlightened Buddhas manifesting in these forms of deity, pictures that we have, actually they're symbolized. Like, transcendence of anger or transcendence of passion. And they usually stand on like a dead corpse, for example, if you see the pictures, which symbolizes,
so on. Yeah.
Which symbolizes the death or the transcendence of duality, you know. So it's not really, you know, literal a dead person there.
Right. It's not at face value, and there's so much wonderful depth. It's like poetry. So what you often see I have 2 tankas in my house, and I have one is dependent origination. And it's a full symbol of that, and that one's, you know, that's kind of complex. There's a lot of steps to it. So having that beautiful representation that draws me into it is a nice reminder of, and here's what that represents.
Exactly.
And here's that moment where I can break this cycle. And
exactly.
What we need, I think, has been very valuable, is having teachers who provide that interpretation of what this is.
That's right.
You've written several books. The one we're talking about now is Rebel Buddha, in particular to the Secular Buddhist podcast, seems very appropriate. Tell us about the book and what prompted you to write it.
Actually, it's my book. This recent book, Rebel Buddha, was a result of my discussions with students in America. We had a number of meetings, formal or informal discussions about establishing a genuine Buddhist tradition of wisdom and compassion in America. And in doing so, we encountered the questions about culture and forms and the pure wisdom. And so, as I always say, you know, Buddhism is like water. It's like a pure water. It doesn't have any color. No color, no shape. Depending on what container we pour this water in, it adopts the shape and the color. And in the same way, this pure wisdom and compassion of the Buddha, if we pour in any container, like American container, it can adopt that shape and it can adopt that color, you know. And so that's how this book was born, from my discussion with my friends, my students, and also, you know, I find that it's really important for us to look deeper into what is culture and what is wisdom.
There's a quote that I'd like to read to the audience from the book, and then have your comments on it. It's a few sentences long here. Mm-hmm. You say, and this is just in the introduction, so it's early on, we need to find a way to connect these ancient teachings on wisdom with our contemporary sensibilities. Only by stripping away irrelevant cultural and social values will we see the full spectrum of what this wisdom is in its naked form and what it has to offer our modern cultures. A true merging of this ancient wisdom with the psyche of the modern world can't take place as long as we're holding on tightly to the purely cultural habits and values of the East or West. Now it's a beautiful quote. It's one of my favorites from the books. I actually defaced my copy of the book and took a highlighter and I marked that one because I liked it so much. I imagine you had some passionate responses, perhaps, about these kind of statements. Can you talk a little bit, if you had any kind of feedback of, what are you doing? You're ruining the teaching. Has anything like that come up?
No, actually, what I see usually is like we both, like, you know, from the East and also from the West, we both hold on to some of our cultural values, you know, and we see these values as absolute values. But actually, when you really look at it, it's not absolute at all. It's really relative of the relative, you know. Like, for example, you know, what we consider something as really being positive and nice in the East is regarded as something maybe a little impolite in the West, you know, and vice versa. And so all of these cultural values, if we take them as absolute and use them as a basis for our practice for the path of enlightenment, then I think it's not going to work.
There's a chapter called A Lineage of Awakening,
Yes.
And I'm right at the section. I'll read the sentence just before the section. The challenge is to discriminate what is culture and what is wisdom, which is an old problem, as it turns out. And you have two stories. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share them with the listeners. One is on Geshe Ben.
Oh, yes.
And another is on Gendam Chopel. Tell us those stories. Tell us about Geshe Ben.
Well, there's an ancient Tibetan master called Geshe Ben. I like his name because it sounds like an English name, Ben. Like
we
Benjamin
picture
or
Gentle
something.
Ben, yes.
Yes, Geshe Benjamin or something like that.
Yeah.
And so there's this Geshe Ben, and one morning he was preparing his shrine. He's cleaning his room and cleaning his shrine because lots of patrons are coming that day to see him. And so he was trying to make it beautiful and so on. And then suddenly he picked up a handful of dust and threw them on the shrine. And that's when he realized that he was doing all these things to impress people. And his motivation or intention wasn't that pure. It's not for the shrine or not for practice or anything, but it's to actually impress patrons. And so that story was retold again and again to show us how, we get caught up in the forms and how we get caught up in our usual values of samsaric values. And in order to really connect with the genuine heart of love, compassion, or enlightened mind, you have to go beyond that.
Yeah, that it's letting go of our perceptions and our attachments that aren't really helpful to leading a happy life.
Yes, or our facade of Dharma practitioners.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we walk in and suddenly we assume this air of we are now going to do meditation and there's
and benefit beings.
Yeah, yes, you can feel that when people take their bodhisattva vow. I noticed this in Jukai and my own and others that I've watched. When people take that vow, they're standing about 2 inches taller after doing that, and that's okay because it's encouraging them in their practice, and it is, I think, a skillful means to elicit the Brahma Viharas, these compassion and loving kindness and upekkha, mudita, and all these. And so there is benefit to that. I was wondering if you'd also tell the other story that you talk about in this section on cultural pressures, a handful of dust, on Gendam Chopel.
Oh, Gendam Chopel, yes. Gendam Chopel, he is a quite controversial scholar and practitioner of Tibet from the late 19th century, 20th century. And he was really a genius scholar and practitioner and quite unconventional. And so one day, he was expecting a visit from very, famous geshes, scholars, highly respected monastic scholars coming to a little, layperson's home in Lhasa. And so on that day, he asked his friend to bring that, most precious statue of the Buddha he had. And so he put that statue on the table, and then he rolled a cigarette out of $100 Tibetan money. And then as soon as the geshes entered the room, he lit the cigarette, and then he started smoking, and then he put the ashes on the Buddha. And so that became a topic of debate.
I would imagine so, yes.
Yes, and the geshe saying, like, how can you do this? So, throw the ashes on the Buddha. And he said, this is not Buddha, it's a statue. And then they started debating about, how can an enlightened being can have dualistic thoughts about good and bad and pure and impure and so on. And so he was a quite amazing scholar here. And he contributed a lot to Tibetan Buddhism, such as he translated the Dhammapada into Tibetan for the first time. We didn't have Dhammapada before that.
Oh, wow.
Translated.
One of my favorite texts.
Yes, so he translated Dhammapada from Pali. And he was very, well versed in Pali and Sanskrit and also English. He studied English in Darjeeling. And recently, actually, I had the opportunity to see his translation of Bodhicharya Avatara into English in his own handwriting.
I wonder, where is it?
It's in Dharamsala.
Oh,
Yeah.
So let me ask, turning things a little bit, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges to Buddhism in the West?
Well, I think in this modern 21st century, post-industrial culture, one of the challenges we have is, I think, the idea of instant gratification, impatience. Instant gratification causes us to become more and more impatient,
Yeah, we're practicing impatience.
Yes. Instead of practicing patience, we are practicing impatience, and we are looking for results on the spot, And even in the worldly sense, some things take a little longer than the other, Nothing you can get really instantly. Even if you get something instantly, it's not necessarily good, right? Like the instant food, like instant noodle or instant burger.
Yeah, not so good.
Not so good, Anything that's really like quality, it takes time, isn't it? Like if you have a quality meal, it's going to take a little bit of time to prepare. It's not going to be instant, And we're looking for something to happen right away on the spot, instantly. Like we're looking for web browsers to web browsers to load instantly on our computer, right? And at some point, we probably will be looking for not even typing the URL, but as soon as you think about URL, it will load on your computer. And we will think like, wow, that would be really great. But actually, it may not be that great. You may be embarrassed some of the pages that's loaded on your computer, right? And then you may have to write a new program to block such thoughts. And so I think that's one of our, obstacles here,
Well, we see that in meditation where people will try it for 10 minutes like, it didn't work, I'm done.
Exactly. Yeah. Or, or the path of nonviolence. Peace is a long process. And nonviolence is a long process. At the end, I think it yields better results than aggression. So we go for something easy and quick and, aggressive approach. That's also coming from like instant gratification, And so I think that's one of our main obstacles here. And second obstacles, I think I feel is the lack of time or busyness, so to speak, No one seems to have time to do anything. You don't have time to do your job well, and you don't have time to do your meditation well. And also you don't have time for your family. And so I think that's becoming one of the obstacles here in the modern culture. And I tell people that, if you really can manage your time well, you have time for everything. It's a question of time management skills. So I think those are the main obstacles we face today. And from Dharma point of view, I think these become quite, problematic. And also another thing is we have difficulty trusting the Dharma or trusting the teacher, trusting ourselves. That's one of the key obstacles here. That we trust pharmaceutical company more than Dharma, right? As long as it's packaged well and it says, Tylenol and sealed, we trust that. We don't know what's in it. Yeah, we don't know what's in it. We don't know what the side effect for long term or anything,
Well, that's a really good question because the patience khanti is one of those traits that we develop as an individual, interactions with others. But the trust thing is a little harder because some of that is based on what those interactions end up being and what we're seeing and what's happening in a lot of our society. And when, issues arise in some centers where there's been some problems, it degrades trust. And so it's harder to get to that point of what can we reasonably trust from our experience. And so how would you suggest to people to deal with that issue of really of doubt, of a lack of trust?
I think it's really a relevant question, There are a few factors here, Number one is the Dharma. There's wisdom that's been taught by Buddha and his disciples. I think, trusting Dharma is not that difficult in general, And we usually have problems with the individuals.
Right. We can see the effects directly of the practice itself. Even just a little application of the Eightfold Path is fairly straightforward, fairly self-evident. There's nothing in there that I think a lot of Western practitioners are going to go, oh wow, that seems like a really radical or strange thing, this whole right speech thing. I think they'll be okay with that.
Exactly.
But it gets more complicated when it's another person, and particularly when they have that a student-teacher relationship, that there's a great deal of trust that needs to be involved with that. And I think you're right, it is harder with people. How do we change that, though, is the question.
That's right. The interpersonal connection is always complex, right? Doesn't matter whether it is between a child and a parent, or between two individuals as a couple, or it's a student-teacher, it's the same thing. It's an interpersonal relationship. And it's always complex, And I think the key point here is, I think, in terms of spiritual relationship here as a teacher-student, I think most important thing is not to make it into a big deal. Not to make it into like, I don't know how to say, very mysterious, mystical,
Not putting so much trust in it that we suspend our judgment, but that we take it as this is another human being.
Yes, this is another human being, and we are developing a friendship, That's what Buddha said, teacher is a spiritual friend. Buddha didn't say teacher is a god.
Right.
And if you take teacher as a god from our, mundane or Judeo-Christian culture background, then it's, I think, our problem there. And when you take teacher as a spiritual friend, another human being, who possesses a lot of wisdom, a lot of compassion, and if you relate to that as another human being, then I think it's easier, And no human being is perfect.
Yeah, it's taking away the expectation of our teachers as being on a pedestal and being perfect, that any normal human foible that they may have means that the teaching itself is bad. No, it's not.
It's true. That's true. It's the same thing as like if you put anyone onto a pedestal, that's going to be a problem, right?
Right.
Whether it's your wife or your teacher.
Right. Well, except the wife. The wife has to go on the pedestal. Happy marriages.
I like that.
So how about opportunities for practice in the West that one might not have in India or Tibet? What do you see that there are some different things that we can that we have opportunities here that we wouldn't otherwise have in other cultures?
Well, I think the richness, the richness of Buddhist traditions in the West. Like we have access to Theravadan Buddhist teaching, we have access to Zen Buddhist teachings, we have access to Vajrayana Buddhist teachings, and you can have all, as much as you want. Whereas in other cultures, it's like usually, what do you call it, homogeneous?
Yeah, you just have one. Yeah.
You just have one, And so I think that's the richness in the West that we don't have in different Eastern Buddhist traditions. But that's changing slowly, Also, it's changing in the East also. We have a lot more interactions between Buddhist communities. A lot of exchange happening. Like, for example, I've been to a number of conferences in Thailand with wonderful Theravada masters and Zen teachers from Korea, from Japan, and from China. And so I think it's been really wonderful.
Well, because there is something that they have to contribute in that as people, they have wonderful perspectives that we might not otherwise be exposed to. Now, I noticed, I was taking a look at your website, dpr.info.
Yes.
And there isn't, you don't have anything listed as specific presentations that you have scheduled, but I did get a note that you will be at the Buddhist Geeks Conference in Los Angeles, July 29th through 31st.
That's correct, yes.
Excellent. Good. People who are interested in that, if you go to Google and just look up Buddhist Geeks, you'll find it. There's information there about that conference, and you can get a chance to hear. You'll be a keynote speaker for this, as I understand it. Well, the book, for people who have been listening to the podcast or are interested in it, I do recommend it very highly because it does give some very direct insight in a modern contextual view of what Buddhist teachings are, and the idea that we don't necessarily have to attach to culture. They can bring something to the table. They can contribute to our practice. But we need to be careful sometimes about what we're distinguishing between a cultural piece and the teaching and the practice. The website for the book is www.rebelbuddha.com. Dzogchen Ponlop Rinpoche, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for the Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.